Welcome everybody to what is probably the best panel really of the whole festival, which is Fresh Blood When Carers Don't Care. Whoever thought up that title did a really good job, I think. Welcome to all of those who are here and also those joining us on Zoom, including viewers throughout New South Wales who are watching from your local library and from your home, courtesy of that local library. Today, it's very important to acknowledge that we're on the beautiful Gadigal lands and we gather to share stories and knowledge and let us reflect on the rich history of storytelling in this place. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and to any First Nations people in the audience today. Before we start, can we please just all ensure that our phones are switched to silent or turned off? Please don't record this session. If you're taking your photos, please turn off the flash and feel free to share on social media. Let's really get that happening. Everyone loves a hashtag, don't they? Hashtag BadCrimeSydney22 at BadCrimeSydney. My name's Margaret Hickey, and I am delighted, so delighted to be with you today to talk in discussion with our wonderful authors, Susan, Lyn McFarlane and Kayte Nunn. Welcome. We'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and then afterwards we'll have some short time for you to answer your for you to take some questions. I firstly thank you for writing such compelling, powerful narratives. Each book, when I read this one, I read them both more than once. I went away thinking about them deeply, about the power of institutions and the bearing of institutions in society, past and present. I'd like each of you, for your audience, if you wouldn't mind, to give just a very 1 to 2 minute snapshot, if you can, I know that's difficult, of what your book is about. So can we start with you?
Absolutely. And perhaps before I kick off, we should acknowledge that we're in the presence of a prize winner this morning. So I think we need a round of applause for Margaret. So my novel, Cut, is the story of Carla, who's a young doctor who wants to become the first female surgeon in a very traditional Melbourne hospital. An assault at a boozy workplace dinner makes it difficult for her. She struggles with the misogyny that is all around her and struggles to compete for the job she so desperately wants. Really, Cut is about what happens when the ambition of a young, independent woman collides with a system made for men by men.
Can you hear me? Yeah. The Scarlet Cross is a novel that's set up on the stormy northwest coast of North America. And it's set in a Catholic hospital. It stars the hospital's emergency nurse, Meredith Griffin. And Meredith starts to notice a pattern of young women coming into her emergency ward and dying from a mysterious laceration. She's very driven to understand why this is happening. Many of the medical professionals around her tend to pass it off as self-harm and suicide, but she's quite convinced that these young women are victims of foul play. So she takes matters into her own hands and investigates, but as she circles closer and closer to the truth, she faces resistance from all sides, the Catholic Church, the hospital, and the police, and at the end finds herself in a race against time to protect the next victim.
The Only Child opens with the suspicious death of an elderly nun in a nursing home on a remote island in the Pacific Northwest of America. And then concurrently, 70 years earlier, a young pregnant 15-year-old girl turns up at a mother and baby home on the island, and there is a tremendous snowstorm, and she and her baby will disappear before the snow melts. And the two strands of the story weave together to uncover the mystery.
They really are fantastic stories. When I was thinking about the three novels, I was thinking that a main thread, there are many threads which run through each of them, but one really powerful one for me was the institution, and the institution that bears down and represses. And this is really interesting because this, of course, takes place in the buildings and places which are meant to be caring places, hospitals, homes for unwed mothers. But these places that you create for us do not seem like safe spaces. Can you please just comment a little bit about that in regards to your own novel and perhaps even about your own work? Can we start with you, Lyn, maybe this time?
Yeah, sure. So I when I began the novel, I wanted Meredith to be, I wanted to write about a caregiver, but I didn't want to write about sort of a traditional caregiver mother figure. I wanted to write about a caregiver in a family. So Meredith is a big sister who is the sole caregiver for her younger sister with a serious medical condition, but she's also a nurse. Again, another archetype for a caregiver. And I guess the thing about nurses, I come from a family of nurses, is that they tend to have the nurses I know tend to have really deep connections with the institutions in which they work. They're really committed to their workplaces and very committed to the patients that they serve. But Meredith finds herself in a Catholic hospital, and I had to grapple with the fact that on one hand, Catholic health services provide a lot of really important services in our community, and nuns do provide a lot of really important services as well. But they're also subject to really strict directives around what kind of care can be given in certain situations, particularly for women who need reproductive health care. And not only that, you know, there's a number of characters in this institution who have risen to the top, who are very committed to their own self-interest, and that means that when there's evidence of misconduct, the institution kind of circles around to not necessarily protect the individual, but to protect itself. And one of my mentors, I'm a lawyer in my day job, one of my mentors just came up to me after reading the book and said, you know, all institutions are weird. And it kind of summarized it for me, that in order to...
In the New South Wales State Library.
Yeah. Yeah. Unless you have a way within an institution to ensure that the institution can police itself, they can, in order to sustain themselves, sustain a lot of misconduct.
Another writer friend of mine has always talked about the fact that with a story, one of the great things to do is to go where the heat is. And over the years, I have watched the changing balance in the Supreme Court, and it's something that's fascinated me. And I could see where things were heading with Roe versus Wade and the kind of restriction on women's reproductive rights. And so that had been a sense of fury and anger for me, and it was bubbling away in the background. When I was thinking about what to write for this book, I started doing a bit of noodling around on the internet, and I came across the stories of the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, and then the Tuam sort of institution, where only about a decade or so ago, they excavated a septic tank in front of this building, and they found the skulls of hundreds and hundreds of newborns. And so I really kind of got very interested in that sort of research. And then I came across a book called The Girls Who Went Away, which is nonfiction, and it's a true anecdotes in their own words of girls and women who were forced to give up their babies for adoption in the 1950s to 60s in America. And so it was the kind of confluence of those couple of ideas that made me decide to set it in the US. And I had a bit more knowledge of the US than I did perhaps of Ireland. and to really look at how girls and women were treated in the past, when at a time when education about reproduction was almost non-existent. Girls didn't know what it took to get pregnant. Often they didn't know they were pregnant until it was far too late. The pill was only available if you were married, and then it was hard to access. So that's where the kind of impetus of the story came, and setting it in a Catholic mother and baby home, because these were so often run by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, safety in hospitals and healthcare settings is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because perhaps we would just assume that these are environments in which women might and staff might feel safe. I've worked in hospitals for more than 20 years, and it's an interesting thing for me to reflect on the culture in the medical system in particular, and I guess the misogyny that I have witnessed directed towards me and other doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals. And I think for me, Me Too was quite a turning point in reflecting on what I had experienced and absorbed, and also talking to other women. I was just staggered by.
So can I just cut in?
Yeah.
What sort of, I mean, if you're okay with it, can you give us an example of just one sort of example of something, with these younger doctors or women's or something that you've observed?
Yeah, I can tell you about when I was a medical student, and we were learning surface anatomy, which is where all the landmarks of the body are placed, and part of the sort of examination process to evaluate your knowledge on surface anatomy was that half the year would turn up in their bathers, and half the year would be the students being examined by the anatomy examiners, who were all male. So this is a long time ago. Bear in mind too that 50% of the year were female. So we all rock up in our bathers, male and female, and there was a particular examiner who was sort of infamous for asking the male students to examine the female individuals, and find their femoral pulse. Now, the femoral pulse, relevant to your story, the femoral pulse is a pulse in the groin, sort of located close to the pubic bone. And so I was the unlucky female sort of lying on this examination couch in my bikinis, kind of feeling a bit exposed. And this poor male colleague student of mine had to kind of grope around in my groin and find my femoral pulse. Now, on the surface, pardon the pun, of it, that's part of learning surface anatomy, but this examiner always had that sort of event happen, and there was something about the way he watched that and made it happen that was very unpleasant to experience. But of course, I did nothing about that. And when I spoke to other women, they had all experienced doctors tucking in their scrubs in the operating theatre, surgeons asking for affection or pressing up against them at the operating table. And, these were talented, independent, autonomous women who had absorbed this behaviour, done nothing about it. And when I reflected on my own experience, I hadn't even really judged the individuals involved. I'd been embarrassed by my response. I'd actually internalized the misogyny so much that I was being harsh on myself for how I was embarrassed that I blushed or burst into tears or did something that I thought displayed my weakness. And I never told anybody about those incidents. So when I sort of think of the hospital culture, I don't experience it as a nourishing culture as a health professional. I experience it as a combative place where I need to look after myself, and where I still, despite all the improvements and changes, where I still struggle to speak up when I see things that I don't think are right.
It's incredible, incredible stories. And really bullying, that's another thing we could talk about as well in all of you, the bullying that went on. Kayte, you are very well known for your historical fiction. I think The Botanist's Daughter, you won a very prestigious award for that novel. And no doubt there'll be accolades coming in for The Only Child. You've talked a little bit about your research that you undertake. This is about orphans, women who have obviously suffered the grief of having children taken away. Was there in all your research, and perhaps you can talk about other books as well, is there a first person, like how do you go about getting to the empathy of these things without it just being facts and figures?
I think it's when I can see a character in my mind that is in that setting, and often it can be sparked by research. It can be just a line in a diary. It can be imagining somebody who might be a composite of a few people that I've come across in my research, that kind of thing. So it's making it very human, I suppose. Once I've got the kind of background research, and I know what era I'm in, and I'm really nosy. So I love to know the detail of how they ate, how they slept, how they got around, all those kind of things, where they lived, all that sort of stuff. But then the characters usually show up to me. In The Only Child, Frankie showed up with her hands on her hips, tapping her foot, going, "Come on, tell the story, please."
And at what moment did she turn up to you? What were you doing how does a character just dump into your mind like that?
I
Tell me the
try
secret, please.
when I'm starting to think about a book, I make sure there's a lovely liminal time before you go to sleep and when you first wake up in the morning. And I don't always succeed, not to pick up my phone and to just start thinking about, it's kind of going on in the background, who might be in this landscape, who are the characters, who wants to tell their story. Sometimes I've taken myself on a very long walk to a place that I feel I'm from the Byron Shire, spiritual energy. And that the story will start. I will start telling myself a story. I think when I was a child, I spent a lot of time quite bored and lonely at boarding school, and I would tell myself stories at night to get to sleep and imagine characters. So there's a bit of that sort of daydreaming, I suppose.
Wonderful, thank you. Susan, we've just talked a bit, and thank you for telling us your story about the hospitals. And it's sort of I'm repeating a little bit what I said then, but there's one quote in your book. It dawned on me that it was the females who had to carry the burden of vigilance. Is it getting any better? And what can we do to make our hospitals, our current hospitals now, better places for women?
I think it is improving. As I said before, even when I was in medical school a long time ago, the gender balance was 50-50. But interestingly, despite that, even into sort of 2015, 2016, the surveys of leadership positions showed that women occupied very few leadership positions in hospitals, less than a third of university sort of medical appointments, those kinds of leadership positions. But now, I think for the first time, the colleges of surgeons and physicians, which are two very powerful bodies that accredit specialist physicians and pediatricians and surgeons respectively, the heads of those two entities are female. Both colleges have action plans on sexism in medicine. So I feel like those things are really positive, but I think we shouldn't underestimate that all doctors, all health professionals have worked in a culture that is steeped in a male way of doing things. So what I mean by that is that those incidents that I was describing to you earlier, and the way that, in particular in medicine, people, I guess there's a strong encouragement not to complain about your workload. do your overtime without telling anybody. When your patient dies, don't show any emotion. And if something bad happens, don't admit it. You know, those kinds of ideas, which might sound to non-medical people, you know, archaic and barbaric. I think there's still a sort of overtone of those, even though things are changing. And so we shouldn't underestimate. I think of it almost like a hangover. It's just sort of still there in the system. And it's in it was humiliating for me to kind of realize it's in my own DNA, this idea of some of those ideas about how I should behave.
So is there a place for it though, sort of keeping a little bit separate, being a bit dispassionate? Otherwise, wouldn't we all just be crumbling messes?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question, and I sort of explored it a little bit in the book. One thing that happens in the book is that my main character, Carla, has something go very wrong in an operation where she is carrying the full responsibility, and it's her first time to sort of be the person carrying full responsibility, and something goes very wrong with a patient. And she finds the boundaries in caring for that patient really difficult. And I really wanted to explore that because it is a challenging thing. You can't have, you know, I work as a geneticist. I break bad news to families about genetic diagnoses in their children. And it wouldn't be appropriate for me to bring my range of emotional responses into the room at the time when I'm telling parents about something. Having said that, if I am an automaton, that's problematic too, right? Some of the feedback I get from families is that when we do show vulnerability and fallibility is actually when the most authentic connections can be made with a health professional. And for me, that's actually the part of medicine that I really like. So I really wanted to explore that. So it is a balancing act to be human and authentic and work your way through the health system and acknowledge your own emotions, but still fulfill the role of a medical professional. And I wouldn't want to say at all that, you know, I think surgery is a very challenging specialty to balance all those competing needs, because you don't want your surgeon to be feeling emotional and anxious when they pick up a scalpel to make an incision on your skin, do you? No. So it's a balancing act for sure.
And something that each of you in your books do really well is you have these characters that are multidimensional. There are many, many aspects to them, many layers to them. I want to talk, Lyn, please, a little bit about Meredith, your main character, because while we're talking about how there's these institutions that are bearing down and repressing, and actually they all feel like they're on the brink of collapse, Meredith herself is very unstable. So you've created this unreliable narrator. At one point I was going, can I actually trust, you know, what she's saying, what's happening here? I found that really fascinating. Was that a conscious decision, Lyn, to make Meredith as unstable as the place she's working in?
Certainly was, at the beginning, at least. So Meredith is dealing with a lot of challenges in her life. She's, as I said before, she's the main caregiver for her sister, who's got a serious medical condition. She's got serious responsibility in the hospital. She leads the emergency department. She's also connected to senior management and has responsibilities more broadly in the hospital. And she was raised by parents in a loveless marriage and lost them very early. So she's got lots of aspects to her character that might drive her to addiction. And she is addicted. At the beginning of the novel, she's addicted to benzodiazepines, which are they're relaxants effectively, but highly addictive.
Sorry, Lyn, I did wonder that about that drug. So why would she take that drug? So you said it's a relaxant. I would have thought that Meredith would need something to kick because she's always so exhausted.
Well, she also takes a bit of Ritalin to pick to pick herself up. So she's got a bit of addiction to a couple of different prescribed drugs, and I mean that's something that I did a lot of research about how medical professionals do or don't have access to drugs within hospitals. And I mean it's certainly something that hospitals, and you could maybe help me with this, tell me if I'm wrong, but certainly it's something that hospitals are very aware of and take a lot of care about trying to prevent, but it still happens. And there's also a lot of street sources for prescribed drugs in North America. Anyway, Meredith does have sources within and outside of the hospital for her dependence. And for some people, Ativan is just like having a drink or two. For others, it can knock them out. So for Meredith, she kind of manages her anxiety through dosing a variety of different drugs. And yes, it does make her unreliable. All of these pressures combined with that addiction or that dependence, as she likes to call it, makes her unreliable. But what I really wanted to establish is an arc for that. I wanted to tackle the notion of addiction because I think in our culture, I think we have a pretty limited public conversation about addiction, about its neurochemistry, about its ubiquity. We tend to stigmatize addiction. We divide things up into, well, that's a bad addiction, and oh, that activity isn't an addiction at all. Whereas I think we could probably benefit from a more robust and sophisticated understanding about how widespread addiction is and how and why we're using substances to manage life. So she deals with it, and the book confronts it head on. I mean, the very first scene is her finding which is something she finds some drugs in a storeroom, and that might not be that. I mean, that's certainly not protocol. You know, these things are usually kept under really significant lock and key. But I use that as an opening because I wanted to make it very clear that drugs were going to be a part of this story. And it makes her unreliable, and it also gives her a bit of an arc, because there is a point at the story where it's very clear that her addiction, and she recognizes that her addiction makes her vulnerable to the very people that want to see her fail. And luckily for Meredith, she's got people in her life who have resources, not just financial resources, but also who have a lot of compassion and give her a lot of this support. And she needs that in order to tackle that dependence and get through it. And it's, you know, one of the things I want readers to take away, I hope readers take away from the book, is just how much we do need support systems, and also that our relationship to drugs, and I think, you know, this is our relationship to substances is a bit odd. I mean, in Australia, we've got a really friendly relationship to alcohol, which is a very toxic and it's a very toxic substance. And we've got very kind of reactive relationships with other kinds of substances, which might not be as harmful. So I guess, you know, I think that it would be helpful in our culture to have that conversation. But yeah, in the end, she does tackle her dependence, and that hopefully over the course of the novel, you see Meredith becoming clearer and also really embracing her instinct and realizing that her instinct isn't just some sort of fog of it's not an addictive high. It's actually her recognizing what's going on in the situation and tackling it.
Each of your characters have that too, that moment where they have to trust themselves. Kayte, I just wanted to move to, how do I pronounce it? Kayte's Island. Yeah. Kayte's Island, which is a fictional island.
Yes.
And can you please just tell us about that setting, why you set it there, and have you lived in that area before?
I did live in the Pacific Northwest near Seattle as a child for 3 years, and I have very vivid memories of that area. And when I was thinking about where to set this novel, having read some nonfiction and stories of American girls and women, it seemed obvious that I wanted to set it in America. And then I chose a place where I had some knowledge. It was locked down, so I couldn't travel there. So I spent an awful lot of time on Google. I really enjoy finding different locations for each of my books. And in a former life, I was a travel writer. So I think that idea of imagining a landscape or seeing a landscape and being able to describe it very succinctly is something that has stood me in good stead. And then these girls were sent away to places where nobody would know them. They were sent far from home. Often they had never traveled beyond the limits of their town or city before. And they often had to travel by themselves on a bus or a train. And they were shut away. They were kept in the dark. And so the idea of a remote island seemed to be the perfect setting. And that part of the Pacific Northwest has a number of islands that are not far from Seattle.
In your book, you talk about, and I could talk about again with each of you, but there's a sense of poverty, and especially in the 1950s, when you said it in the earlier times, in poverty or girls who just didn't have enough, or there enough care or enough resources or anything. But then this is also juxtaposed by this magnificent old building of this institution, and that just seemed to make the whole thing more grotesque in a way. And it's the same with yours, the St. Jude's Hospital. It's meant to be this epitome of love and kindness and something we look up to, when in actual fact the most horrible things go on there. Was that a purposeful thing for you, Kayte, to make that building, to do it like that?
Not especially, actually. No, that was probably completely subconscious. The women, the girls that went there, that some of them would have been poor, and the Catholic Church very kindly would offer to pay for their care, in return for which they got a baby at the end of it that they could give to a more deserving Catholic couple. So that's pretty horrific. That kind of sense of shame, I think, was something I was really interested in exploring, in the way that these girls were shamed. In the 1950s in America, it was a time of the great American dream, the perfect family. And I wanted to contrast that with what actually happened to these girls. They were this sort of dirty little secret that was tidied away and taken care of.
And what was the statistic? Was it 1.5 million?
It was a period of about 30 years in the second half of the 20th century, and 1.5 million babies were given up for adoption in the US. There aren't so many statistics available in Australia, but I did do some sort of comparative research, and I think it was around 250,000, and but there were no records kept for Indigenous babies that were taken away with the stolen generation. So, and it's something that happened, across the Western world. And it was about shame, and the girls were shamed for this. It was their fault that this happened to them. Unless there was a shotgun wedding, which often did happen, the men and the boys were not held accountable in the same way at all.
This whole idea of pain, forcing them to kneel on the nettles and pray in these cold, is that?
That was a little bit of artistic license there, but they were bound to the bed when they were in labor. They were often left on their own for hours on end. They had nobody with them. Some of these girls would come in still clutching their teddy bears from when they were kids. And they were told to be quiet, as if making a noise when you're in great pain was something that, you really weren't allowed to do. So that part about being bound really struck me as something quite shocking and horrific.
I mean, it just made me think about how Margaret Atwood said all of her work is nonfiction. I felt that when I was reading.
Somebody actually, one of the early reviews said this reads as nonfiction. And I think as a fiction writer, that's a great thing to try and strive for.
Well, in actual fact, that's a really lovely segue. Thank you. Because all of your work reads like nonfiction. At one point, Sue, in yours, I was thinking, is this a memoir? Is this not all the time, but I was thinking this heavily draws on your own. And I could feel that too, Lyn. I felt that you had real intimate knowledge of these nurses, particularly psychiatric nurses. And I think you've said, or you've mentioned somewhere, haven't you, that you worried that you might get some pushback about that? Like, have either of you felt that you would get pushback in your workplaces?
Not necessarily in my workplace, because I'm not a nurse or a doctor. And I actually, when I was writing it, I did actually, speak to a lot of nurses, speak to a lot of doctors, and had it read by doctors and nurses who are working right now. And they luckily said that they liked it and they appreciated it. I was a bit worried about there is obviously a strong theme in the book around psychiatry, and I'll listen. I think, there's great professionals and there's not so good professionals, but I did not at all want to, cast aspersions on the entire profession. And I think, that my conversations with psychiatrists reflect the fact that they don't feel that way. Yeah.
Yeah, my experience is similar in the sense that I think I hope that the book asks questions about the culture of medicine and gets health professionals or contributes to the conversation that I hope health professionals are having more and more, women and men, about what they have absorbed in terms of medical culture and what's healthy and what's not. And in exactly the same way, I think of the surgical fraternity, the word itself is interesting, as having a range of...
Is that what you call it, the surgical fraternity?
I don't know, that just came into my head. That might be rubbish, but yeah, no, that's how I would describe it probably.
Actually, like, you often talk about the legal fraternity, and I think that's just a throwback.
Band of brothers kind of thing. We few, we marry few. Yes.
Yeah, I think there are a range of amazing, caring doctors and doctors who for whom their ego is perhaps the strongest driving force. And I think if we were to stereotype surgeons, that is something that is still an ongoing kind of theme that I would observe from time to time. So hopefully people can understand that there is a range of humans, like there is in every profession.
I want to ask you, before we move to questions, I want to ask you one more question, and that is, what's next for you? Please tell us what is in the pipeworks for you authors. So, Kate, would you like to go?
Yes, I'm just working on redrafting a story that has a very strong crime focus again, and less of a historical one. It's set in the present day and then 20 years earlier, and it's looking at the way siblings can have the same experience but totally different recollections and accounts of it. And so 3 siblings reunite at a remote cabin where 20 years earlier there was an event that fractured their family.
And will the middle child be the most troublesome? Will they be the murderer or... No?
Well, actually, interestingly, it's 2 sisters and a brother, and the brother's the middle child. But yeah, I've enjoyed really writing very different characters.
And Kate, can you tell me, what's the shift? You said the shift is moving sort of from historical crime more into... Has that been difficult for you, because you're so well known as in your historical space?
Thank you. It does feel like moving the Titanic, and it's a slow process. I have to really believe in a story to want to spend 6 to 8 months writing it. And so it's the story first and the idea that captures my imagination. I'm hoping there are similar themes throughout each novel, so that readers who've loved the historical fiction will love the sort of more contemporary crime as well.
Thank you. Lyn?
I am working on book 2. It takes some of the characters from the Scarlet Cross and drops them into a new story that really focuses on computer crime and pits them against each other. Where the Scarlet Cross really had a theme of compassion, the theme in book 2 is betrayal.
So when you talk about computer crime, are we talking hacking? Are we talking... what's catfishing? What sort of cybercrime? Or can you not tell us?
Well, it's Russian and Ukrainian hackers. Quite relevant.
Will there be an election involved in your... No? Okay. What about you, Sue?
I want to read those books. So I've got this kind of weird hybrid thing where I toggle between writing young adult and adult fiction. So I have a young adult novel that I previously published, and I have another young adult novel that I'm redrafting about a concealed pregnancy, actually. So it's been fascinating chatting about some of the issues facing young women who have unwanted or unplanned pregnancies. And I'm brainstorming an adult novel because I can't help myself, which is about a palliative care doctor who has a sixth sense about death, and just exploring that idea. And the brainstorming phase is so much fun before I have to pin myself down to a plot.
So a sixth sense about death. What do you mean? Like how do you...
She has an intuition when death is imminent. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for.
I can't decide whether that would be a really good thing or a really bad thing. I've enjoyed talking with our authors so much, and I know some of you will have burning questions. I showed the authors before. I've written pages and pages of notes, so I could talk about these books till the cows come home, as my granddad says. But I'd like to see if any of you would have any questions first. Does anyone have a question for one of our panelists? Yes.
Sorry to make you run all the way. Yeah, I guess speaking about the setting in your book, Kate, the thing that I'm curious about is setting specifically in the context of care when it is such a global issue that we're facing at the moment. How can the specificity of where you set your book tell a story about something that is so universal without leaving out people or saying too much about things that change around the world?
I don't think in one book you can be all things to all people. And actually, for me, the most important thing in writing is specificity. It's something I focus on an absolutely granular level to make it more believable. And I think you find the universal in the specific, and that's something that I'm always quite focused on.
Just to add that I think to the maybe the emotional authenticity of your story is where that universal, where the reader can hopefully identify, certainly I did reading your book, with the characters. And so even though those environments are so alien and different to my life experience, the emotional authenticity of the characters' experiences were things that resonated for me.
Thank you, Susan. You put it much better than I could.
Thank you. I've got a question which is more about writing. So one of you is a new writer, and the other two of you are writers who've written in different genres, or somewhat different genres, certainly before. What was it like, first of all, to get published at all if you hadn't written a book before and you weren't a journalist or you didn't have those contacts? And for the others, how easy was it to go into different kinds of writing? Is it difficult to break out of one area to get into the other?
Well, so I had wanted to write novels from an early age, and I did try. So I've got a couple of unpublished ones in my desk drawer. But I had decided about 6 years ago that I wanted to try again. And I guess it was just a matter of having an idea that captivated me enough to actually sit down and put in the work and energy and time and dedication. And I do think that, I mean, if I work full time, so it was really about kind of finding the right sort of pattern to actually make it, bring it to fruition. I think people talk about talent and creativity as the key elements of writing a novel. I actually think it's grit and energy and discipline, and as much as anything else. And I think there were also really important moments where I looked to other writers and what they were working on to give me inspiration, and also other writers talking about the process of writing. Geraldine Brooks has a wonderful saying, and I often repeat this because I think it's so true. With her usual Australian wit, she asks, do bricklayers get bricklaying block you know, and I really appreciate that. I've got that by my computer because it's just like, you know, you just have to sit your butt down in front of the screen in those moments where you've got the time to write and get those words down, lay those bricks. So yeah, but getting an agent, getting a final manuscript, getting an agent, getting a publisher was a tremendous experience. Took a lot of work and took a lot of patience, a lot of persistence. And yeah, I'm ready to go back for more.
Can I talk very briefly about my experience? My first two novels were women's contemporary fiction set in vineyards because I had edited a wine magazine previously, so that was my background. But then
that must have been a horrible job.
was one of those.
Yeah, you
Let me tell you about the time I edited a spa magazine. That was even better. And then my third novel was historical fiction without me really thinking about what I was writing. It was the idea that came to me first. And though I had worked in journalism, I didn't have any publishing contacts. It was, cold calling, not cold calling, but, cold submissions. It took me several months to find an agent, and then it took me a year to find a publisher. So it was a slow process. But with my third book, because it was so different, I changed publishers and they treated that novel as a debut. So that really helped set me on a different path.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've had a similar experience in terms of I've published with the same publisher, Affirm Press, my young adult novel and Cut, but they are considering this like a debut because, of course, well, my young adult novel is for young adult readers, 11 to 15, about basketball, and a basketball obsessed teenager who has a rare genetic condition. Those of you in the audience who remember I do genetics will be thinking, yep, we're on to her. But of course, there's not a lot of readership overlap between a book about misogyny and sexual assault and basketball. And I think if I was very savvy about these things, I might not have pursued both of those ideas in parallel as I did, but my brain doesn't really work like that. I have to pursue the ideas that I'm really stuck on and I'm really passionate about. And I think that's not brilliant from the point of view of sort of designing a publishing career. But, I think it was you, Lyn, who said that you have to love that idea because you've got to return to that idea even when it is really giving you the shits and you can't work out what to do with your plot and it's got a saggy middle and you can't fix it and you can't see the way through to the end. There has to be something about it that makes you go back there for more.
Well, on that note, I think we all will want to go back for more with these three authors because they've been so fabulous. Can we put our hands together for them, please?